For more, we're joined now by Ebenezer Obadare. He's a Douglas Dillon Senior Fellow for Africa Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. Dr. Obadare, what can we expect from these next 3 days of talks?
Thank you for having me. I think you can expect everything. You can expect Ukraine to be on the table. You can expect the economic situation in Africa to be on the table. You can expect issues around political transition, security, everything that pertains to relations between Africa and the West and Africa and the United States specifically. I think you can expect all these leaders gathered in Washington to talk around all these issues.
Now, Dr. Obadare, President Biden is expected to formally throw his support for the African Union to join the G20. How is that support likely to translate into any concrete outcome soon?
It's a great question. I think the first thing that we should realize is that African countries wanted this move. They wanted G20, so to say, to become G21. And it's consistent with what many African leaders have been talking about over the last 10 years. They want Africa to have a place at the table, and they want Western countries and European countries to take African agency more seriously. Membership of the G20, as they see it, will be an extension and it will put a seal on this particular wish of African leaders to be literally present at the table where decisions are being taken. I think it's a great move. The concept itself is a very good one. What comes out of it, what African countries and G20 members hope to get out of it, I think that will be a totally different thing, and we are bound to see as in the foreseeable future.
Dr. Obadare, this second U.S. Africa Leaders Summit, it's been a long time coming, quite a gap from the last one 8 years ago. There has been criticism for Washington being an unreliable partner to African nations. How is the United States going to overcome that image and perhaps navigate the skepticism that there must be?
I think the message got across to the United States. And the reason why I'm saying that is, if you look at the new U.S. strategy towards sub-Saharan Africa, you can, if you think about some of the deliverables that the United States is thinking about, there are 4 of them. A commitment to foster openness and open societies, to deliver some democratic and security dividends, to advance pandemic recovery and economic opportunity, and to support conservation, climate adaptation, and a just energy transition. If you look at all those 4 commitments, they are coming out of a particular realization that the strategic milieu in Africa has changed, that there are new actors at play on the continent, that the United States can no longer afford to take African agency and African leaders for granted. So it's to the extent that African complaints were meant to send a message to the United States, I think you could say that that message has been received, especially if you look at those commitments. How the commitments themselves are pursued, whether the special envoy that the United States has now appointed, what role he plays, and how the interaction between the special envoy and African leaders, how that plays out, remains to be seen. But I think we're in a very good situation. If you're an African citizen, or if you're an observer of the situation in Africa, you sort of see this changed mood in Washington, and it's something to applaud, because it means that the United States realizes that it can no longer be business as usual when it comes to Africa.
Now, both the U.S. and China have downplayed concerns of Africa turning into an area of competition between the 2 superpowers. But this is a continent that's been receiving large amounts of Chinese investments in recent years. What could the U.S. game plan here be?
I think it's very obvious that, so both parties will deny it. China will say that it's not in competition with the United States, and the United States will say it's not in competition with China. But we do know that both are struggling for influence and for hegemony, across the world. China started doing business with African countries, not just because China wants to gain economically, which it should, but China also sees itself as, it sees Africa and its relationship with African countries and African leaders as a test run for all the other plans that it has. So China knows that if it's able to secure the interests of African countries, if it's able to increase the number of allies it has on the continent, that it will help it in its strategic contest with the United States. On the part of the United States, the United States also realizes, as I mentioned earlier, that it's in no position to allow China to consolidate its toehold on the continent. So if you look at it that way, if you are from the point of view of Africa, it's a very, very good time. African countries can leverage the competition to advance African interests. They can make requests of the United States that they probably wouldn't have made, maybe in the last 10 years. And they can also make requests of China because they can say, look, if you can't give me this thing, the United States can give it to me. So from the point of view of African agency, things have never been rosier.
You mentioned at the beginning of this discussion, Dr. Obadare, that you felt that the war in Ukraine was probably likely going to be on the table as well during this summit. Russia is a key player in Africa too. Several African nations have remained neutral with regards to the war in Ukraine. What to you might be the manner in which conversations surrounding the war in Ukraine will perhaps transpire during this summit?
So thank you. So there are two sides to the Ukraine question. One is the military question. The United States realized that after the conflict broke out in February, that it could no longer afford to take African countries for granted. And I think that one of the points about the conflict that people tend to miss is that there wasn't actually a single African position. So there was Eritrea, which is an outlier, of course, but African countries were actually split down the middle. There were countries that, refused to join the Western Alliance, and there were also countries that basically stood on the fence, which is very interesting because if this conflict had taken place maybe 10 years ago, a decade ago, when the strategic terrain in Africa was more or less different, maybe African countries will have en masse broken for the West and the United States. So that's the military part. I'm sure the United States will want a situation where those on the fence at least are persuaded to join the Western Alliance. But let's not forget that the Ukraine conflict is not just about the war. It's about some of the other consequences that have arisen from the outbreak of the war. Food security, the effect on migration, African students who were in Ukraine who are to come back. Some of these other issues will become part of the conversation. But here is the final thing. This war, whether it lasts for another year or 2 years or 3 years, will come to an end at some point. From the point of view of the West, I think the important thing is to think about the context and the character of relations between the United States and Africa once this war is over, because someday the war is going to be over. And what the United States and I imagine Western diplomats want is a situation where once the conflict itself ends, the Western countries and the United States and Africa will be on the same page. There's a lot of ground to cover, and Western policymakers who want to make sure that that ground is not lost when the conflict itself is over.
Right. We want to thank you for your insights, Dr. Obadare. That was Ebenezer Obadare, Douglas Dillon Senior Fellow for African Studies at the Council of Foreign Relations.